So welcome to Chapter 2 of Applied Cross-Cultural Psychology PSYC 379. This chapter is going to be looking at the methodology of cross-cultural research. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about are the goals of cross-cultural research. And in the following scenario, I want you to imagine a researcher who wants to find similarities and differences between arranged marriage practices in India and non-arranged marriage practices in the United States, and then look at how they affect marital stability. So what does the psychologist aim to pursue in this particular project? First, the researcher wants to describe the findings of this research. Then when some differences between ethnic groups are found, the researcher tries to explain whether these factors affect stability. And the practical value of the study may be significant if it not only explains but also predicts the factors that should determine successful marital relationships in both studied groups. So there's two strategies in cross-cultural research that we're going to be thinking a little bit more about, and those are application-oriented strategies and comparativist strategies. One of the major concerns of any cross-cultural study is going to be that of equivalence. And this term stands for the evidence that the methods selected in the study measure the same phenomenon across cultures that are chosen for the study. So, for example, if method A is chosen to study anxiety in France and Italy, but method B is used to study anxiety in India and Pakistan, then the results might be incompatible just due to equivalency problems. So in order to address part of this concern, there's a multi-step approach to cross-cultural research design that will take this into consideration. So here's a sample, and we'll go through this step by step. Step 1 is describing a problem or an issue that you have to investigate. So to do this, you want to review scholarly literature on the topic, and then in addition, you might use popular journals, magazines, and newspapers as additional references. It also could be helpful to check available sources in the language of the country or countries you're examining if you feel like that's necessary. Step 2 is identifying your research goals. So, for example, explaining what you want to achieve as a result is essentially what you're trying to do. Then you want to introduce one or several hypotheses for your study, and you can use two different strategies to come up with these hypotheses. The first is inductive, and that's when you collect data first and then you make conclusions about the studied samples. The second is deductive, and that's when you select a hypothesis first and then collect data to demonstrate or reject the selected hypothesis. The third step is to identify and describe the research sample of your study. And you're looking at groups of people, newspaper reports, children's drawings, texts, etc. Step 4 is choosing or designing a methodology for your project. And when you do this, you really want to make sure that you're not going to violate any research ethics. And in order to ensure this, you should refer to your local Human Subjects Review Board, or IRB, or HSRB, for approval. And what you'd be doing is you'd be putting together a schedule or a timetable for your project and having it approved. Step 5 is conduct a pilot study, and this is a preliminary exploration of your method to see how your methodology is going to work and whether there's any obstacles to data collection. And then you're actually going to start collecting your research data. So that would be step 6, which is apparently on both sides. And then step 7, you're going to interpret your data using statistical procedures. And then after that, step 8, present the results and analyze them critically in a report. And then finally, step 9, in your report, it's really important to suggest where and how your data should or could be used. So whether this is going to be helpful for those in education, counseling, advertisement, conflict resolution, etc. So it's really important not just to have a solid methodological foundation for your research, but also make interpretations and include things in your discussion that are actually going to be helpful for those that are reading. So you can target people a little bit more, point them in the right direction about how this could potentially be useful for further research or potentially in the field. So there's a couple of different ways to select samples in cross-cultural research. We're going to be talking about convenient sampling, systematic sampling, and random sampling. And it's important to note that estimates derived from large samples are going to be more reliable than estimates derived from smaller samples. Just in general, larger sample sizes are considered to be able to produce more valid results. So when forming judgments, some people, though, don't really take this principle into account. And as a consequence, despite the fact that data collected from small samples cannot be counted quite as trustworthy in predicting people's characteristics or a population's characteristics, sometimes people will still do that and might be prone to commit the error of overgeneralization from too small of a sample. So this is important not only to consider when you're conducting your own research, but really when you're critically analyzing somebody else's existing research and they've generalized it to an entire population, you really want to think about whether or not that was appropriate given some of the constraints of their research, one of which might be sample size. So there's four basic methods of cross-cultural research that I'm going to kind of touch on here and was also elaborated upon in your book: experimental studies, observation, survey methods, and content analysis. So for scientific observation, most of the time, non-scientific observation is going to be spontaneous and it can be biased. So the observer's attitudes can have an impact on the result of observation. A scientific cross-cultural observation should really be using measurable variables. So for example, a study might measure how fast individuals walked on the streets of New York, Tokyo, or Tehran. Surveys are another method that's oftentimes used. They're perhaps the most common technique of data collection in cross-cultural psychology. And in a typical survey, then the researcher is asking the subject to express an opinion about a particular topic, a belief, an issue. These are all done through self-report, which can have a number of limitations, including social desirability effects, as well as limited by the ability of the participant to accurately or kind of willingly express what they genuinely think or believe. This can also be extremely context specific, and so that's something that researchers just need to take into consideration regardless of what population they're going to be working with. And then there's just an additional note of an example of subjective well-being that the textbook talks a little bit more about, and then you can read through if you'd like. Then we have scientific experiments in which we have an independent variable, and these are the conditions controlled by the experimenter. And this is going to kind of predict the variance in the outcome or kind of predict the actual outcome of the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is what you're actually studying. So what you expect there to be differences in between different groups, for example. And then another method would be content analysis. And this would include meta-analyses and focus group methodologies. So there are a number of obstacles to cross-cultural research. I'm going to talk a little bit about test translation, cultural applicability, and cultural bias. So test translation, for example, if you're bilingual, you'll have to translate phrases like sexual harassment from English to another language, but then back again to English for analysis. And because of this, there can be just a substantial amount of information that's not only lost, but also confusion amongst participants as well as the researchers involved in the study. Then there's cultural applicability. So you really want to consider how your questions might not just translate in other cultures, but how kind of worthwhile they are to ask or how applicable they are. So I have an example that might help clarify this, and this was also presented in the textbook. But Alfred Binet helped create one of the first IQ tests in the early 1900s. So here's an example of a question that was placed on this IQ test. And just consider how easy or helpful it might be to ask somebody in another culture this type of a question. So a child from a Western culture would be asked this question to help assess their IQ. My neighbor has just received some singular visitors. He received one after the other, a doctor, a lawyer, and a priest. What was going on at my neighbor's? So it's important to think not only whether a child from a non-Western culture could understand the question, but depending on the differences between that culture and a Western culture, would this even be an accurate or worthwhile assessment of somebody's IQ, their ability to, in many ways, just function within their culture and thrive and succeed? The third thing that we're going to talk about is cultural bias. So this, I'm going to also just include a note from the text. So the authors talk about a study that found that in self-assessment surveys, 3 national groups consistently marked themselves as the hardest working: people from Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Respondents from Chinese, Korean, and Japanese samples, however, evaluated themselves among the least hardworking in the world. So what this is kind of demonstrating is that it's important to consider not just what the cultural narrative is about, how they're doing relative to other people in the world, but also just take into account how different cultural beliefs might skew what they're reporting, especially since a lot of these are based off of self-report, which are inherently subjective, which in some ways is going to be exactly what you want to study, and in other ways might actually hinder the applicability of your findings. Okay. So when we're comparing phenomena in cross-cultural psychology, there's really 2 different fundamental ways that you can be thinking about this. There's an absolutist approach, which is also called a universalist approach, and there's a relativist approach. So psychologists supporting the absolutist approach will argue that the psychological phenomena are basically the same in all cultures. Honesty is honesty, sexual abuse is abuse, depression is depression, no matter where, when, or how the researcher studies these and other psychological phenomena. Within this approach, oftentimes there is a tendency to use the standards of one group as the norms when viewing other groups, so something to consider. The relativist approach suggests that human nature or human behavior is, in its full complexity, can be understood only within the context of the culture in which it occurs. So therefore, the scientists should study an individual's psychology from within their own culture. So it's important, again, for you not to consider only just how you're going to be approaching your own research, but what are some of the just fundamental ideological underpinnings of the researchers that conducted studies that either you're interested in, you're referencing in literature reviews, or you're using for different types of projects, or all sorts of different things. But it is important to consider what are the approaches of the researchers and how that potentially is going to shape what their findings are. Lastly, I wanted to end this chapter with a warning. So beware of common pitfalls. I'm specifically going to be talking about cultural dichotomies and avoiding biases of generalizations. And then I just included some pictures that somewhat tangentially help reinforce the point. So a sign that says wet when raining as a caution sign. And unfortunately, somebody developed and actually produced a DVD rewinder, if you can't read the copy on the side of that, which, as you may or may not be aware, DVDs are not the same as VHS tapes in which they need to be rewound. If you don't know what VHS tapes are, then you just ignore that picture. Okay, so cultural dichotomies. There could be fewer differences between 2 dissimilar groups than you might think. And conversely, there could also be more differences between 2 apparently similar groups. The whole point of this is that without comparisons, there's no cross-cultural psychology. When we compare, take for example, emotional expressions in 2 countries or test scores in 2 national or ethnic groups, what we're doing is we're looking for similarities and differences between 2 variables. When comparing any 2 phenomena, initially they might match with respect to their mutual similarities, but no matter how many features they might share in common, there's just really no escaping the inevitable fact that at some point they're going to differ. So the point kind of where these phenomena differ is sometimes referred to as the point of critical distinction, or PCD, which is also talked about in the book. So the PCD is before that point, there's a lot of similarities, and after that point, there's going to be kind of different outcomes. It's also important to avoid biases of generalizations. So to avoid making quick generalizations from research findings, it's important to ask yourself a couple of questions. So the first is, what were the size and representation of the chosen samples in the project? So for example, if the study included only 50 subjects from 2 countries who answered a couple of survey questionnaires regarding attitudes towards religion, it's really not possible to make a reliable conclusion about religious differences between the studied countries. This is where it's important to have replication studies and then eventually to do meta-analyses where you're looking at a whole bunch of different studies that have measured the same variables in the same groups, and then combining all of the findings so that you have one massive meta-analysis. So another question to ask is, was the method chosen for the study adequate in different cultural settings? Was it translated properly? And when it could be demonstrated that the instrument produced in one setting was applicable in other settings, then you might start to consider whether the differences obtained with that instrument could be a reflection of cultural variables. But you definitely don't want differences to be a result of differences in the methodology as opposed to cultural variables if you're interested in the cultural variables. And that goes back to one of the first slides with, if you have one instrument used in these countries and another instrument used in another country, then you really don't have equivalency. And then you want to ask yourself, are the data convincing? So to make sure that the results of a study reflect a particular trend and are not due to chance alone, the researcher should repeat the same study to find out, repeat the same study or find out about similar studies. And again, this ties into the meta-analyses. And then lastly, you should also ask yourself, are there any factors that could have affected the outcome that were not taken into consideration in this study? So you might want to consider, for example, the social, political, environmental, and physiological factors. And this is a concept that most of you are probably familiar with from the research methods classes that you might have taken or statistics classes, where you're looking at causality. So does A cause B? Does B cause A? Or is there some third variable that might be impacting both A and B? So for example, one that you might have heard before and one that I always like to use in the classes that I teach is, let's say there was a study that found that in July and August, there was a very strong relationship between ice cream and murder. The more ice cream that was eaten, the more likely or the higher the murder rate was, the homicide rate. So, as a good researcher, of course you're going to conclude that eating ice cream leads people to murder other people. Or perhaps that murdering people really makes people hungry for ice cream, and so they're going to go out and buy more ice cream. So clearly, brain freeze causes murder, or clearly murder causes you to crave ice cream, or potentially there's a third factor. So for example, maybe that the heat makes people more irritable and likely to kill, and also makes them want more ice cream. So this is where causality comes into play, and you have to be really careful about kind of the conclusions or the inferences that you're making. So you want to avoid biases of generalizations and just consider all of these different factors, and also take other research findings with a grain of salt and consider whether or not they've really accounted for some of these potential pitfalls. Okay, so that was the end of Chapter 2. At this point, I just want to remind you again to make sure you take the Chapter 2 quiz and post on the discussion boards. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great week.